Beneath the busy streets of downtown Chicago, far from the noise of traffic and neon, a quiet hum pulsed through the brick-lined tunnels leading to the Heritage Circle. It wasn't marked on any tourist guide, nor was it listed on Google Maps. Those who came knew where to find it, or knew someone who did, and tonight it was packed with men and women who wore their years like medals. The air inside was thick with wood polish, aged whiskey, and the scent of leather that had absorbed 100 years of sweat and memory. Red velvet curtains framed the arched entrances, and dimmed brass chandeliers cast a warm amber light over the crowd. Marble floors creaked beneath patent shoes. Tuxedos and tailored suits mixed with vintage jackets and creased faces, many of whom bore the quiet dignity of having once bled for something that mattered. Tonight was the annual Legends and Legacies Gala, a private celebration, honoring the history of combat sports and the warriors who once made crowds rise from their chairs in thunderous ovation. The ring at the center wasn't lit yet, but it waited patiently. It wasn't new, not by a long shot. Its ropes were slightly frayed and the canvas had been replaced more times than anyone could count, but the frame beneath had remained the same since 1962. For those in the know, that ring was sacred ground. Up in the commentator's booth, overlooking the arena, Veronica Hale adjusted her headset and sipped slowly from a porcelain teacup, ignoring the flurry of activity around her. Her silver hair pulled back neatly shimmered under the lights. A thin scar traced the outer edge of her left eyebrow, a permanent reminder of the time she went 6 rounds against a Cuban national champion in Havana, back when she was young, fearless, and thought pain only happened to other people. She glanced across the ring at the VIP balcony. Samuel Steelheart Cole sat quietly, his cane resting against the velvet railing, a leather glove on one hand and a folded program on the other. He was dressed sharply with a pressed gray suit and a matching vest, his lapel pinned with a faded photograph of his late trainer. Time had bowed his spine slightly, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the room with the alertness of a man who never stopped reading opponents. Veronica's voice drifted through the room's sound system, low and smooth. "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the annual Legends and Legacies Gala. Tonight, we honor not just the warriors who once lit up arenas across America, but the principles they carried. Grit, honor, discipline, and respect. For some, those words are outdated. For others, they're all that remains." Across the room, Victor Grayson leaned against a private bar carved from oak and overlaid in gold trim. His teeth gleamed unnaturally white, and his jacket shimmered purple under the low light cut to perfection and studded with subtle brand logos. He tapped urgently on a sleek tablet, monitoring live engagement from multiple social platforms. Numbers were climbing. It was good. Very good. Victor was the man who made this event profitable again, though not always with class. He knew how to turn nostalgia into views and views into sponsorships. He was the reason the event now included live streams, hashtags, and influencer entrances. He didn't believe in fighting tradition. He believed in monetizing it. He turned to his assistant, a young woman in a headset with a clipboard clutched to her chest. "Where's Blaze? He's supposed to be on cam by now." Her eyes darted toward the hallway. "He's filming himself, walking in just like you wanted." Victor smiled, half satisfied. Let the kid do his thing. His followers eat this stuff up. In the hallway, just outside the Grand Arch, Jaxon Blaze Rivers walked with the swagger of a man who had never been told no. His entourage trailed behind him, stylists. A cameraman, a PR rep with a Bluetooth in each ear. He wore a gold-trimmed robe that sparkled with every step. His jawline was sharp, his expression smug. A phone, mounted on a gimbal, tracked his every word. "Yo, Blaze Nation, what's up? We live in the Heritage Circle, where they're holding a gala for old men who used to punch each other back when people still used fax machines." He grinned at the camera, tossing a wink. Tonight, we're bringing the future to the past. And maybe, just maybe, we'll send the past home in a wheelchair. The camera caught some of the younger guests laughing behind him. To them, Jaxon was entertainment. To his opponents, he was a nightmare. Undefeated in MMA deadly fast, with a chin like concrete and a mouth that never stayed closed. He made more from brand deals than most fighters made in their careers, and he knew it. He entered the arena to a soundtrack of thunderous bass fire jets blasting on either side of the aisle. Screens around the room lit up with his name and a rolling montage of his knockouts, his viral interviews, and his branded products. The crowd divided neatly. Younger fans clapped, raised their phones, and some even chanted. Older guests sipped quietly and exchanged measured glances. As he approached the ring, Jaxon spotted Samuel Cole sitting upright in his seat. Without breaking stride, he pivoted toward the boxing legend and smirked. Look who they dug up for this dinosaur convention. You good Steelheart. Or do you need help getting out of that chair? A ripple of discomfort spread through the room. A few phones turned away from Jaxon. Veronica leaned closer to her mic. Some say progress means forgetting the past. I say those people never learned anything from it. Up in the shadows near the far side of the room, a man sat alone at the edge of the balcony. He wore a soft cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and jeans that had seen better days. A cap covered most of his hair, but not his eyes. Not the eyes that had once stood unshaken in front of world champions, dictators, and studio cameras alike. Chuck Norris didn't come to make a scene. He came to see an old friend be honored. He'd known Samuel Cole since 1969 when they shared a locker room at a benefit fight in Detroit. Samuel had pulled Chuck aside back then and told him how to anchor his weight against taller men and how to speak softly even when your fists made noise. Chuck never forgot. Now he watched Jaxon Rivers strut in front of cameras, smirking at the living embodiment of dignity. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly. Victor Grayson leaned toward the production booth. Cut to Cole. Get that reaction. Zoom in. The cameraman obeyed, but Samuel didn't give him much to work with. He sat still, postured straight, with his eyes fixed forward and unbothered. His cane rested across his lap like a saber waiting to be unsheathed. Jaxon climbed into the ring, threw his arms wide, and shouted into the mic. Let's go, baby. The future is here. The past can take a nap. Lights dimmed briefly. Veronica's voice returned steady and slow. Before we begin tonight's exhibition, we take a moment to remember the ones who paved the road. Without them, none of us would be here. Not in this ring. Not in this room. Not even watching at home. A single spotlight cut through the darkness and landed on Samuel Cole. He didn't rise. He didn't wave. He simply nodded once. Some clapped. A few stood. The applause was respectful, if brief. The silence that followed said more. In the booth, Victor rolled his eyes. Sentiment doesn't sell. Action does. Cue the next hype reel. But from the shadows, Chuck Norris saw something different. He saw an old lion sitting still, not because he was weak, but because he had nothing left to prove. A king never begs for a crown. He just keeps showing up. The night wasn't over, not by a long shot, but in that moment, the heritage circle belonged to Samuel Cole. And somewhere in the silence, the past whispered back. The bell rang before most people in the crowd had settled back into their seats. Jaxon stood in his corner, bouncing lightly on his heels, flashing a grin as his opponent approached the center of the ring. Across from him stood a seasoned fighter named Dominic Reyes, a tough, quiet man known for his relentless endurance. He had 37 fights behind him, and a reputation for dragging his opponents into long, ugly wars. None of that mattered tonight. From the first exchange, it was clear this wouldn't be a war. It would be a statement. Jaxon came forward with a speed that blurred. He launched a right cross that snapped Dominic's head back before the older fighter could even set his feet. The crowd gasped as Dominic stumbled, already unsteady. Jaxon didn't let up. He unleashed a flurry of sharp punches, each one finding its target with brutal precision. Dominic tried to clinch, but Jaxon ducked low, driving a savage hook into his ribs. The sound echoed like a gunshot, and Dominic folded. He staggered backward toward the ropes, covering up, but Jaxon was already there, cutting off every angle, picking his shots with cruel efficiency. Veronica's voice cut through the stunned air, calm but firm. "He's fast. He's powerful. But right now he's not fighting a man. He's dismantling him." Dominic swung wildly, desperate to buy space, but Jaxon slipped the punch with ease and delivered a clean uppercut that sent him crashing to the canvas. The referee darted in, counting quickly. Dominic's eyes were glassy, his arms trembling, as he tried to push himself upright. 6, 7. He stayed down. The fight was over. Jaxon raised his arms before the referee finished the count, grinning as the crowd roared. The younger fans leapt to their feet, cheering and recording every second. Some chanted his name while others whistled in admiration. Victor Grayson's eyes lit up as he watched the numbers spike on his tablet. He nudged his assistant with glee. "That's it. That's the shot. We're going viral tonight." Jaxon strutted across the ring, flexing for the cameras, basking in the electric wave of applause. Sweat gleamed on his skin, his chest heaving from the short, violent burst of action. He grabbed the microphone from the announcer without waiting for permission, and just like that, another one bites the dust. He pointed toward the crowd, flashing his signature grin. They said this guy had heart. Maybe he left it in the locker room. Some laughed, some booed. Jaxon didn't care. But he wasn't finished. He turned slowly, eyes scanning the room until they landed on Samuel Cole, still seated with his cane resting across his lap. Jackson's smile widened, sharp and cruel. "You know what gets me?" he said, voice dripping with mock amusement. "They bring us here to honor these old guys. They tell us about grit and honor and all that other stuff from black and white TV." He raised an eyebrow, gesturing toward Samuel. "But, let's be honest, nobody under 50 even knows his name." The younger fans erupted in laughter, some shouting encouragement. A few of the older attendees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. Veronica's tone sharpened as she spoke into her microphone. "He's crossing a line. That man broke barriers in this sport when it wasn't safe to do so. He earned every scar." Jaxon wasn't listening. He pointed again, leaning over the ropes in Samuel's direction. "Tell me, Steelheart, how many of your old fights are trending right now?" He paused, letting the question hang, savoring the tension. "I bet my last Instagram story got more views in 30 seconds than you had spectators in your whole career." The room grew heavier, the energy shifting from amusement to discomfort. Even some of Jackson's fans looked uncertain now, lowering their phones as they sensed the mood changing. Samuel remained still, his face unreadable, his gaze steady. Victor watched from his booth, his excitement growing. He leaned forward, whispering to his assistant, "Let him go. This is pure gold. The more they hate him, the more they watch." Jaxon leaned casually against the ropes, eyes never leaving Samuel. "It's funny. They called him Steelheart, right?" He tapped his own chest mockingly. Back then, maybe that meant something. But tonight, it just means rusted. Laughter rippled through the younger crowd, but it was thinner now, less certain. Chuck Norris sat motionless in the shadows, his eyes locked on Jaxon. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But his presence deepened, solid and quiet as stone. Veronica's voice carried softly through the speakers filled with quiet anger. "He doesn't understand the weight of his words. Or maybe he does. And that's even worse." Jaxon pushed off the ropes and began pacing the ring, speaking loudly enough for every corner to hear. "This is what I don't get." He spread his arms wide, playing to the crowd. "We celebrate guys who fought 15 rounds, throwing 3 punches a minute, moving slower than traffic in a snowstorm." He mimicked an exaggerated slow-motion jab, drawing scattered chuckles. No wonder they lasted so long. Nobody was trying to finish the fight. He smirked, pointing at Samuel again. "You didn't fight warriors. You fought dinosaurs." A wave of boos rolled through the room, more forceful now. But Jaxon basked in it, feeding on the attention. You know what separates legends from fossils' relevance. He raised his arms again as if embracing the entire arena. "I'm trending right now. I'm filling seats. I'm making money. That's what matters in this world." He pointed sharply at Samuel, once more his voice growing louder, sharper. "You might have been a champion once, but tonight you're just another old man sitting in a chair, clapping for someone who took your spot." Silence settled over the arena, heavy and uncomfortable. The older guests sat stiffly, their faces tight and restrained. Some of the younger fans looked around nervously, unsure whether to laugh or remain quiet. Samuel finally moved slowly, rising to his feet, his cane supporting his weight. He stood tall, his back straight, despite the years, his gaze calm but unyielding. The room seemed to freeze. Jackson's smile faltered for the briefest moment before he recovered, grinning wider. "Oh, he's standing." He gave an exaggerated mock gasp. "What's the plan?" "Steelheart, you gonna shuffle up here and show me how they fought during Prohibition?" The younger crowd laughed, but it was thinner than before, hesitant. Chuck remained still, though his gaze grew sharper, more focused. Victor whispered excitedly to his assistant, nearly vibrating with glee. "This is insane. Keep rolling. Don't you dare cut away." Jackson's tone turned mocking, his words slicing through the room. "Look at him, leaning on that cane like it's a trophy. He's not a champion anymore. He's a warning label. A reminder of what happens when you don't know when to quit." He let the words hang for a moment before delivering the final blow. "I tell you what he said," pointing directly at Samuel. "Why don't we make this interesting? Why don't you come up here right now and show me what you've got?" Gasps filled the room. A few cameras turned toward Samuel, others toward Jaxon, trying to catch every angle. Veronica's voice was low and steady, her words heavy with meaning. "He's crossed into territory he doesn't understand, and he won't like where it leads." The arena held its collective breath, waiting for what would happen next. For a moment, the room stood still. No one moved. No one breathed. Samuel Cole remained steady, his hand resting lightly on the handle of his cane. He didn't respond, didn't speak, but his presence seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. He looked at Jaxon with the same calm he might have shown decades ago, standing across from an opponent who hadn't yet learned respect. Jaxon, emboldened by the silence, smirked wider and gestured toward the steps leading into the ring. "Come on then, old man. Show us all what your so-called legacy really means. Or sit back down and let the future keep winning." His voice echoed through the arena, bouncing off the marble walls and hanging in the charged air. The younger crowd erupted, some cheering, others urging Samuel to rise. Phones shot up again, capturing every second, ready to broadcast this standoff across every screen in the country. But the older attendees stayed quiet. They watched, their faces unreadable, their eyes locked on Samuel, knowing something the younger crowd didn't yet understand. Veronica's voice drifted through the speakers, steady and cool. "Some men don't need to speak. Their presence says enough." Chuck Norris watched from his place in the shadows. He hadn't moved since the first insult was thrown, but now his gaze shifted. Slowly, calmly, he rose from his seat, his posture relaxed but unmistakably solid. The crowd began to notice him. One by one, heads turned as whispers spread. "Is that him?" "That's Chuck Norris. He's here." Chuck didn't acknowledge them. His eyes remained fixed on Samuel, who remained standing composed and quiet, refusing to react to Jaxon's challenge. Jaxon, noticing the shift in attention, scoffed and laughed into the microphone. "Oh, look who we've got back there." He waved toward Chuck's direction, his voice dripping with mockery. "Another relic from the past. What's this reunion night for has-beens?" The younger fans laughed nervously, though many weren't sure if they should. Jaxon grinned wider, feeding off the reaction. "Maybe you want to come up here too." "Grandpa," he pointed towards Chuck, his voice growing louder, "I've seen the memes, I know the jokes, but this isn't some internet fantasy. This is real life. And here, real life hits hard." Chuck remained silent. Veronica's voice softened more to herself than to anyone else. He has no idea who he's talking to. Victor Grayson was nearly shaking with excitement now, frantically motioning to his production crew. "Keep rolling. Every angle, every mic. This is history in the making." Jaxon kept pushing, strutting across the ring with exaggerated swagger. "Tell you what, since everyone loves a good nostalgia story, how about we spice things up tonight?" He gestured wildly, drawing attention back to himself. "First, I knock out this old-timer in the front row. Then maybe I'll let Chuck Norris himself have a go. We'll call it the retirement tour." Laughter scattered through the crowd, but now it was mixed with a growing undercurrent of unease. Samuel's face remained unchanged. He stood still, eyes steady, unmoved by the storm of words around him. Chuck's expression was unreadable, but his presence had shifted. He no longer looked like a quiet guest at the edge of the room. He looked like something else entirely, a storm waiting to break. Jaxon, oblivious to the shifting mood, raised the microphone again. "What's wrong, Steelheart?" No words left. No old stories to tell. He leaned against the ropes, voice dripping with false sympathy. "It's tough, isn't it, watching your era get erased one knockout at a time?" He gestured toward his own corner, where his team of handlers and social media managers stood still recording every second. "This is the future," he said, sweeping his hand across the arena. "Fast, ruthless, unapologetic, the old days are gone, and so are the old men who clung to them." The words landed hard. This time there was no laughter. There was only silence, a heavy, weighty silence, thick with tension that could be felt in every corner of the room. Veronica's voice dropped to a whisper, slow and deliberate. He hasn't heard it yet, but the room has already turned. Jaxon looked around, confused by the lack of applause. He raised the mic again, pushing harder. "You know what I see when I look at men like him." He pointed again at Samuel, his voice sharp and biting. "I see the past. I see faded posters and dusty trophies. I see the reason why the sport needed someone like me to drag it into the present." His words cut through the air like a knife. "I see everything I never want to become." He smiled, proud of himself, expecting cheers. But none came. Instead, all eyes slowly shifted toward the back of the room where Chuck Norris had begun to walk. He moved with purpose, each step deliberate, calm, and unhurried. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The crowd parted for him without being asked, the same way waves retreat from the shore when a storm rolls in. Victor Grayson's face lit up with greedy joy. "Yes," he whispered, leaning forward, his voice shaking with excitement. "Yes, let this happen." Jaxon, now noticing the shift, blinked in confusion as he saw Chuck approaching. He laughed nervously, trying to regain his footing. "Oh, he's really coming up here?" He shrugged, playing it off with mock bravado. "Guess we're making this a 2-for-1 special." But his voice wavered ever so slightly. Chuck reached the edge of the ring and stopped, his gaze fixed on Samuel. For a moment they simply looked at each other. No words were exchanged. But in that silent glance, something unspoken passed between them. Something old and deep and carved from decades of shared understanding. Then Chuck nodded once, slowly, respectfully. Samuel returned the gesture, his expression calm and steady. Chuck turned his eyes settling on Jaxon, who stood frozen near the center of the ring. And without a word, Chuck began to climb the steps. The room held its breath. Each step echoed like a drumbeat, slow and deliberate, drawing every eye, every heartbeat toward him. He reached the apron and paused, then slipped through the ropes with the ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times before. Jaxon backed up slightly, his earlier bravado beginning to crack. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," he said, holding up his hands. "Are you serious right now?" Chuck didn't answer. He stood tall in the center of the ring, calm, composed, and utterly unshaken. Veronica's voice was soft, but filled with quiet awe. Some men carry their history like armor, and some carry it like a sword. The arena remained silent. No one moved. No one dared. And in that silence it became clear. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Jackson's breath quickened as he watched Chuck Norris stand before him, calm and unmoving. The weight of the moment pressed down harder than the cheers from earlier ever could. He had stirred something that wasn't meant to be provoked. He forced a smirk, though it faltered at the edges. "All right, Chuck, you made your entrance. Get the crowd back on your side." He let out a short, nervous laugh, bouncing lightly on his toes to regain some sense of control. "What's next? Are you going to show us your famous roundhouse?" Chuck didn't move. He didn't even blink. His gaze stayed fixed, steady, and patient, as if studying not a man but a child mid-tantrum. The stillness unnerved Jaxon more than he expected. His voice grew louder, faster, trying to fill the silence. "Come on now. This ain't the movies." He gestured around at the silent crowd, his tone edging toward desperation. "This is real life, not some cheesy action flick." The crowd didn't laugh. They didn't react at all. They only watched. Veronica's voice slid through the speakers, calm but sharp as a knife's edge. "Some men speak without saying a word, and that's the loudest sound there is." Jackson's smirk disappeared. He pointed toward Chuck, his voice rising again. "Do you think standing there makes you a threat? Do you think your name still means something here?" Still no answer. Chuck's silence pulled tighter around the room, turning every second into a stretched wire. Jackson's voice cracked slightly under the pressure. "Do you really think you can just walk in here, stare me down, and change the story?" He laughed, but it was hollow now, the sound barely reaching the corners of the arena. "This isn't about you, or him." He jerked a thumb towards Samuel, still standing outside the ring, steady and dignified. "It's about me. It's about now." Chuck's calm presence didn't waver. The tension rose again, almost unbearable. Victor Grayson leaned forward, his grin wide and sharp. "This is it. This is everything." He motioned wildly to the camera crew. "Keep it rolling. Every second. Don't miss a thing." Jaxon squared his shoulders, trying to reclaim some semblance of dominance. "I get it. You think you're teaching me something." He moved closer, his voice dropping into a lower, biting tone. "You think this little stunt makes you a hero, but I don't play by your rules. I don't care about history. I care about winning. Right now, in front of the world." Still, Chuck didn't speak. Veronica's voice dropped to a murmur filled with quiet certainty. "He's already won. Jaxon just doesn't know it yet." Jackson's frustration boiled over. He threw his arms out wide, shouting into the air. "You want me to fight you, fine." He turned sharply toward the crowd, his words coming faster, harsher. "You all want it, right? Do you want to see your childhood hero get humbled by reality?" Some of the younger fans shouted back, uncertain but curious. Others stayed silent, sensing something heavier in the air. Jaxon faced Chuck again, jabbing a finger at his chest. "Let's go then. Let's end this." He sneered, though his voice trembled now just enough to be heard. "Just know, you asked for this. Chuck finally moved, not with speed, not with any hint of aggression, just a slow, steady motion as he removed his watch and handed it gently to a nearby referee who looked too stunned to speak. The simple act made the arena feel smaller and tighter. Chuck rolled his sleeves up with unhurried precision, his face serene, untouched by all the noise and lights. Jaxon's chest rose and fell faster now. His bravado cracked with each breath. The crowd watched in near silence. Some older fans had tears in their eyes, sensing what was about to unfold. Victor was grinning wider than ever, nearly shaking from adrenaline. "We're about to make history," he muttered to himself. Chuck finished rolling his sleeves, then slowly lifted his hands, not into a showy fighting stance, but something relaxed, effortless, almost casual. Veronica's voice returned soft, but weighted like an anchor. "This isn't about violence. It never was. It's about showing where real strength comes from." Jaxon swallowed hard, but there was no turning back. His voice dropped low, harsh, and tense. "Don't say I didn't warn you." With a sudden burst of speed, Jaxon lunged. He threw a sharp jab fast, and clean-aimed straight for Chuck's face. But the strike didn't land. Chuck shifted just slightly, his feet barely moving. Jaxon's punch cut through empty air. The room gasped. Jaxon recovered fast, throwing another strike, then another, each faster, harder, more desperate. Chuck evaded them all with the smallest movements, calm and precise. Jaxon's face flushed red as frustration took hold. He launched a flurry, now fists flying wild fury replacing technique. Chuck stepped aside once more, letting the storm pass him by. He hadn't thrown a single punch. But already Jaxon looked exhausted. His breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. Sweat trickled down his temples. The crowd watched in stunned awe, hardly daring to blink. Veronica's voice floated through the arena, her tone hushed and reverent. "He's not fighting back because he doesn't need to." Jaxon stumbled, chest-heaving, as Chuck remained still poised, waiting. The younger man's voice broke with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Fight me," he shouted. "Stop playing, fight me." Chuck tilted his head just slightly, his gaze steady. Then, with one smooth step forward, he reached out and tapped Jaxon lightly on the chest with 2 fingers. That was all. Jaxon froze. The crowd inhaled sharply as the young fighter's face shifted from rage to confusion, then to something that looked a lot like fear. The tap hadn't hurt him. It hadn't knocked him down, but it had landed. Perfectly. Effortlessly. Jaxon staggered back his arms, dropping slightly at his sides. He looked around, lost, searching the faces of the crowd for something. Anything. The arena remained silent, the moment hanging like a held breath. Chuck lowered his hands, stepping back with calm grace. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Jaxon stood alone in the center of the ring, drenched in sweat, trembling with adrenaline and something he couldn't name. The only sound was Veronica's quiet, steady voice. That's the difference between a man who fights for cameras and a man who fights for something more. Chuck turned toward Samuel, outside the ring, offering him a small nod. Samuel, still standing tall, returned the gesture, a flicker of approval passing between them. In that simple exchange, everything shifted. The crowd began to rise slowly, respectfully. Some clapped, others simply watched too. Moved for words. Victor Grayson sat back in his chair, stunned for the first time all night, unable to spin what he had just witnessed into a soundbite. Jaxon remained frozen, his entire world spinning beneath his feet. And Chuck Norris simply walked away. The room followed him with their eyes, watching him exit as quietly as he had entered. No words, no celebration, just the quiet certainty of a man who had said everything without speaking at all. The fight was over, but its lesson was just beginning. It began with the smallest of movements, in the quiet storm that followed the clash. Inside the ring, Chuck Norris slowly pushed himself up from his chair. There was no announcement, no spotlight, no fanfare. He simply stood. At first, few noticed. The eyes of the crowd were still locked on the stunned figure of Jaxon Rivers in the center of the ring. Some stared at Samuel Cole, who remained tall and steady near the edge of the floor. But slowly, almost as if guided by instinct, people began to shift their gaze. Chuck had not rushed. He moved with calm precision, steady and deliberate, as if every step had already been measured long before this night ever arrived. His face held no expression of anger or triumph. There was only quiet focus in his eyes. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't glance at the screens flashing around him. He walked with purpose, every step weighted with something unspoken but deeply felt. His presence began to pull the room toward him, drawing every glance, every breath. Those closest to him fell silent, first their conversations dying mid-sentence as they watched him pass. Heads turned, following him with reverence. The murmur spread like a ripple through the sea of faces. Chuck paused briefly as he reached Samuel's side. The old champion turned his head slowly, meeting Chuck's eyes with a calm gaze of his own. Nothing needed to be said. In that brief glance, everything was understood. It wasn't the look of two strangers passing by. It was the look of men who had shared the same roads, carried the same burdens, and knew what it meant to endure. There was no pity, no judgment, only mutual respect and deep understanding. Chuck gave the slightest nod. Samuel returned it with equal measure. Then Chuck turned his attention forward and continued his approach. The crowd remained silent, caught in the strange gravity of the moment. Even the younger fans who once shouted for Jackson's name now sat frozen, watching something they could not fully explain. Chuck walked toward the steps of the ring, every movement unhurried and precise. His boots barely made a sound against the floor, but the weight of his presence grew with every stride. Victor Grayson sat at his table, his mouth half open, his usual bravado, stolen by the sudden shift in the room. His fingers hovered above his tablet, but he had forgotten all about numbers and clicks. Chuck reached the base of the ring, placing one hand lightly on the rope. He paused there, his gaze steady, his breath even. He did not sun the crowd or play to the moment. He simply existed within it. Then, with smooth control, he lifted himself onto the apron, stepping through the ropes with quiet grace. The ease with which he moved made it clear this wasn't his first time crossing into that space. Inside the ring, everything changed. The lights seemed softer now, though they hadn't dimmed. The noise from the crowd seemed distant, even as every seat was filled with people leaning forward in breathless anticipation. Chuck stood tall in the center, facing no one in particular. His posture relaxed but ready. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't strike a pose. He simply stood calm and rooted, as if he had always belonged there. Jaxon Rivers remained near the opposite corner, his chest still heaving. His confidence cracked beyond repair. He stared at Chuck with wide eyes, the reality of the moment sinking deeper with every heartbeat. Veronica Hale's voice drifted through the speakers, soft and reverent, as if she too was afraid to break the spell. Some men command the room with noise, others do it with silence. The arena remained quiet, held tight by the invisible thread of respect now woven through every corner of the space. Chuck's hands stayed loose at his sides, his breathing steady, his expression unreadable. He wasn't there to prove anything. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough. The longer he stood there, the heavier the moment became. Even those who had once scoffed at his name now sat still, unable to look away. Victor's voice finally broke through in a whisper, barely audible even to himself. He didn't need to say a word. Chuck's gaze finally shifted, resting once more on Samuel outside the ring. A quiet moment passed between them, again deeper than before. A shared legacy, old and unbroken. Then Chuck turned back towards Jaxon, his face calm but unflinching. He hadn't spoken, but his message was clear. The air remained thick with tension, but it was no longer chaotic. It was steady, like the hush that comes before a storm. Every person in the room felt it in their chest, the certainty that something unforgettable had just begun. Chuck stood there unmoving, and the entire room waited. He had risen without sound, approached without words, and entered the ring without force. Yet somehow he had changed everything, and the legend had only just begun to rise. Chuck Norris stepped fully into the ring, his movements smooth and unhurried. He didn't glance at the cameras or the roaring crowd. His gaze stayed fixed on Jaxon Rivers, who stood in the opposite corner, watching with a twisted smile. Jackson's voice rang out his words sharp and loud as he tried to mask the tremor hiding behind his cocky tone. He spread his arms wide, pacing with exaggerated flair as he addressed the crowd. "So this is really happening. Huh? We got ourselves a real-life legend stepping in to show us all how it's done." The younger fans cheered their excitement, mixing with nervous laughter. Phones were already raised again, capturing every second, their screens glowing under the dimmed lights. Jaxon kept playing with them, feeding off their attention even as the mood shifted beneath him. He pointed toward Chuck, smirking as he spoke louder, daring him to respond. "I hope you brought your walker, old man, because once this starts you won't be able to lean on your reputation." Chuck said nothing. He didn't even blink. He simply reached down, removed his wristwatch, and handed it calmly to the referee, who accepted it with shaking hands. The gesture was quiet, but it sent a ripple through the room. Every camera zoomed in, capturing its simplicity. No rush, no words, just steady, controlled preparation. Victor Grayson's eyes lit up his entire body, leaning forward as he barked orders to the production crew. "Get every angle, every camera. Do not miss a second of this." The entire arena seemed to tilt toward the ring as though gravity itself had shifted. People leaned forward without realizing it, their breath caught somewhere between their chest and their throat. They were witnessing something they would remember forever. Jackson's smile twitched at the edges as he tried to keep up his bravado. He pointed again, circling slowly, his voice thick with false confidence. "Do you think standing there quietly makes you mysterious?" He laughed, the sound hollow in the quiet room. "You're just another old fighter hanging on to the past, trying to squeeze out one last moment under the lights." Chuck's face didn't change. He remained calm, his stance loose but centered, as though the world around him moved at a different speed. Jaxon kept talking, desperate, to fill the space that Chuck refused to occupy with words. "Look at you standing there like you're carved out of stone. Do you think you scare me? Do you think this crowd scares me?" But the crowd wasn't laughing anymore. They weren't cheering either. They sat still, their eyes locked on the quiet man in the ring who hadn't said a word. Chuck slowly adjusted his stance, rolling his shoulders once, then settling into a relaxed position. His hands stayed open at his sides, his feet planted steady and sure. He looked like a man ready to begin a slow dance, not a fight. Veronica Hale's voice came softly over the speakers, barely more than a breath. "He doesn't need to say anything. His presence says it all." The tension grew heavier, filling every corner of the arena. Victor's excitement reached a fever pitch as he barked again at his team, his voice breaking through the stunned air. "Keep it tight. Keep it on him. This is history." Jackson's voice rose again, but there was a thin edge to it now, one even he couldn't hide. "Fine. You want to do this the silent way." He squared his shoulders, lifting his fists with a flourish meant for the cameras. "Let's give these people the show they came for." But his eyes kept flicking towards Chuck, unsure. Chuck didn't react. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't even shift his feet. He just watched, patient and steady, as if waiting for a storm that was bound to come. Jackson's bravado slipped further, though his words kept tumbling out faster now, like a man running from his own doubt. "I'll show you that times have changed. I'll show everyone here that the old ways don't work anymore." Still, Chuck didn't move. The hush deepened. Somewhere in the back of the room, an old veteran leaned forward and whispered to the man beside him. "Watch this. He's not here to fight like the kid expects." Jaxon let out a breathless laugh, his chest rising and falling faster now, though he tried to hide it behind a grin. He pointed one last time, voice loud but strained. "I hope you're ready for this, because I've been waiting to put someone like you back in their place." Chuck's eyes remained steady calm as still water. Without a word, he shifted his weight slightly, just enough to center himself fully in the ring. He stayed loose, hands still lowered, but everything about his stance said he was ready. Not to fight for show, but for something deeper. The room grew impossibly quiet. Veronica's voice returned low and reverent, barely more than a whisper. "He's not here to trade punches. He's here to remind us all what real power looks like." Jaxon bounced on his toes, trying to shake off the weight in the air. He raised his gloves, calling out again, his voice louder but more desperate. "Are you sure you don't want to back out now? No shame in walking away before it gets ugly." Chuck's expression didn't change. He just waited. Victor Grayson's heart pounded in his chest as he watched from the ringside, his eyes wide with greed and awe. This is it. This is the moment that'll go around the world. In the ring, Chuck's calm presence wrapped tighter around the space, a quiet force that made every breath feel like it might shatter something fragile. The arena waited trapped between two generations, one burning hot with noise and pride. The other stood still, steady as stone. And in that stillness, a new kind of storm began to gather, not loud, not violent, but certain, inevitable. No one expected the challenger to have already won the room, and the fight hadn't even begun. The bell never rang. There was no need for it. The fight began in silence, carried by the thick air of expectation pressing down on every person in the room. Jaxon moved first, springing forward with youthful speed and sharpness. His punch cut through the air fast and precise, aimed straight for Chuck's face. It never connected. Chuck simply wasn't there. With a subtle shift of his shoulder, he let the punch pass harmlessly by. His feet barely moved, yet his entire body seemed to flow out of reach. The crowd let out a soft gasp, their eyes widening as they saw Jackson's fist strike nothing but empty space. Chuck remained calm. His breath steady, his gaze unreadable. He didn't counter. He didn't even raise his hands. Jaxon frowned, circling again, his confidence flickering. He snapped another jab, this one faster. Sharper designed to catch any hesitation. Chuck leaned back by a fraction, just enough for the fist to slide past his chin. The movement was smooth, almost effortless, as if Chuck had been standing there waiting for it all along. His eyes never left Jackson's, steady and patient. He still hadn't thrown a single punch. Jackson's frustration grew. He launched a third strike, followed by a quick hook mixing in speed with angles meant to overwhelm. Chuck sidestepped gently, letting the blows fall through empty air once again. There was something mesmerizing about the way he moved. No wasted motion, no sudden bursts of energy, just calm, deliberate grace. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their earlier cheers forgotten. Even the younger fans sat frozen, their phones lowered without realizing it. Jaxon clenched his jaw, his breathing picking up as he circled again. He feinted, trying to draw Chuck in, but the older man didn't bite. He remained perfectly still, perfectly balanced. Jaxon darted forward again, throwing a quick combination, his fists flashing through the dim light. Chuck's movements remained small, his body slipping around the strikes with uncanny precision. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't dramatic, it was simply correct. Every time Jaxon committed to a strike, Chuck was already gone, stepping just far enough outside the line of attack. His footwork barely left a sound on the canvas. Jackson's strikes grew wilder and more aggressive, and his pride began to unravel. He spun into a back fist, throwing his entire body behind it, aiming to overwhelm him. Chuck pivoted smoothly, leaving Jaxon swinging at shadows. The difference between them became clear. Jaxon was fighting the air, chasing ghosts. Chuck was dancing with it, always a step ahead. Veronica Hale's voice drifted softly through the speakers, quiet and filled with awe. He's not fighting to win. He's teaching. Jackson's face flushed with frustration. He stormed forward again, this time mixing kicks into his attack, throwing sharp, low strikes meant to trip Chuck's balance. But Chuck was already moving his body, swaying away from the kicks with perfect control. He didn't block. He didn't counter. He simply wasn't there when the strikes arrived. The younger fighter's desperation grew more obvious with each miss. His breathing turned ragged, his punches less crisp, his footwork more frantic. Chuck remained as calm as ever. His face showed no strain, no effort, only quiet focus. Jaxon shouted in frustration, hurling another furious barrage of strikes, spinning and twisting, hoping to land anything. Chuck's response was the same as before, graceful steps, small pivots, smooth shifts of weight. He made it look easy. The longer it went on, the clearer it became to everyone watching. This wasn't a contest of power or speed. It was a lesson in control. Jaxon stumbled slightly after a missed kick, his chest heaving, his hands dropping lower than before. Chuck didn't press forward. He didn't take advantage. He simply waited patient as the tide. The crowd watched in stunned reverence, their earlier thirst for violence replaced by quiet awe. Even Victor Grayson sat silent at ringside, his eyes locked on the ring, his hands frozen in place. Jaxon wiped the sweat from his brow, glaring at Chuck with raw frustration. He raised his fists again, though his arms trembled slightly from exhaustion. Chuck's posture never changed. He stood steady, his breathing, even his presence unshaken. Jaxon lunged one more time, throwing his weight behind a desperate right hand, a strike meant to end it. Chuck slipped just to the side, and the punch missed by inches. He remained close enough to touch, yet untouched. Jackson's momentum carried him forward, and he stumbled into the ropes, his arms tangling briefly before he righted himself. Chuck still hadn't thrown a single strike. The lesson was plain to see. Veronica's voice came softly, a quiet thread of words that wrapped around the moment. Discipline. That's what we're seeing. Pure, unshakable discipline. Jaxon backed away, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his pride crumbling with each breath. Chuck stood in the same spot, unmoving, his eyes locked calmly on his opponent. There was no anger in his gaze, no condescension, only quiet certainty, as steady as stone. The crowd didn't cheer, they didn't boo, they simply watched, spellbound by the quiet storm unfolding in front of them. Jackson's face twisted with anger, but beneath it was something else. Fear, confusion, the creeping awareness that he wasn't just losing a fight, he was losing something deeper. Chuck didn't need to strike. He had already dismantled his opponent with nothing more than patience and precision. And as the room held its breath, watching the dance of discipline unfold, it became clear to everyone. Some battles are won with fists, others are won with stillness. Jackson's breath came in short, ragged bursts. Sweat dripped down his face, stinging his eyes, but he didn't wipe it away. He couldn't afford to look away. Not now. His fists stayed up, though his arms trembled under their own weight. He circled Chuck again, slower this time, his feet dragging just enough to show the exhaustion creeping in. His face flushed with frustration and confusion. A storm of pride and disbelief clouded his judgment. He had thrown everything, every strike, every trick, and landed nothing. Chuck remained still. He hadn't changed his stance. He hadn't raised his hands. He hadn't broken a sweat. Jackson's chest heaved as he stared across the short distance between them, realizing there was nowhere else to run inside that ring. He lunged again, pushing through the fatigue, trying one last time to break through the calm wall standing before him. But Chuck's feet shifted by only an inch, his body flowing around the punch with the same smooth grace he had shown all along. He let Jaxon's fist sail harmlessly past, allowing the younger fighter's momentum to pull him forward. And then it happened. Chuck's hand moved with calm precision. No wind-up, no sudden flash, just a simple, direct motion. He extended his hand and tapped Jaxon's chest right above the heart. The touch was light, barely more than a breath, yet it stopped Jaxon cold. The crowd went silent. It was not a strike meant to harm. It carried no force, no aggression, but it landed with a weight that Jaxon had never felt before. He froze, stunned by the contact. His mouth opened slightly, his eyes wide as though he couldn't believe what had just happened. His body stayed rooted in place, his arms lowered almost in surrender. Chuck lowered his hand immediately, after stepping back with quiet composure. He returned to his relaxed stance as though nothing had occurred at all. The entire arena seemed to hold its breath. No one dared to speak. No one moved. Jaxon stood in the center of the ring, paralyzed not by pain, but by realization. That single deliberate touch said everything he had refused to hear. Veronica's voice drifted softly through the speakers, her words wrapped in reverence. That wasn't a strike. It wasn't meant to be a defeat. It was a reminder of what control truly looks like. Jackson's eyes remained locked on Chuck, his chest still rising and falling as he processed the moment. He had been faster. He had been stronger. He had shouted louder, but none of it had mattered. Chuck's calm had been unshakable from the beginning, and now with a single touch he had made it impossible to ignore. The younger fighter's face changed slowly as its weight sank deeper. The anger began to slip away, replaced by something quieter, something closer to understanding. Chuck said nothing. He didn't follow up the tap with words. He didn't gloat or posture. He simply stood still, allowing the moment to speak for itself. The crowd, still hushed, began to grasp the meaning too. They watched not a fighter humiliate an opponent, but a master deliver a lesson. Victor Grayson sat at the ringside, his jaw slack and able to process what he had just seen. For once, he had no words, no strategy, no spin. The cameras kept rolling, catching every angle, every stunned expression. Veronica's voice filled the space again, soft but steady. This isn't about winning or losing. It never was. This is about showing that true power isn't just in the fists. It's in knowing when not to use them. Jackson's breathing slowed. His posture shifted, no longer tense with defiance, but weighed down with humility. His eyes dropped briefly to the spot where Chuck had touched him, as if trying to understand how something so simple could feel so heavy. The room remained silent, fully aware they had witnessed something rare. Chuck gave no further motion. He waited patient as always, giving space for the meaning to settle, and it did. The message had been delivered loud and clear without a single word spoken. In that quiet, shared moment, everyone saw the same truth. The fight had ended the moment Chuck decided it would, and all it took was one touch. Jackson's lungs burned, but his pride burned hotter. He stood in the ring, his arms heavy, drenched in sweat, but he kept his fists raised. He wasn't sure if it was instinct or desperation that kept them up. Across from him, Chuck remained still composed, untouched by the storm that had already passed. He hadn't moved from his calm, steady place in the ring. He seemed to exist outside of time itself. Jackson's chest tightened as he watched Chuck's face, calm and unreadable. There was no sign of strain or anger, only patience. And that patience unnerved him more than any punch could. He shook his head as if to clear it, bouncing lightly on his toes, though every movement felt heavier now. His legs ached, but he pushed forward again, trying to silence the creeping doubt inside his head. He had faced tough fights before. He had always found a way through, but none of those fights had ever felt like this. He launched another jab, sharp and fast, aiming for Chuck's jaw. Chuck swayed back with the slightest shift to the punch missing by less than an inch. Jaxon followed with a hook, but Chuck turned just enough to let it slide past. It wasn't evasion through speed. It wasn't a reaction. It was as if Chuck had known where the punches would be before Jaxon had thrown them. Jackson's frustration built. He gritted his teeth, throwing a low kick meant to catch Chuck's leg. Again, nothing. Chuck simply stepped out of range, calm and precise. The crowd sat in breathless silence, watching, as Jackson's strikes grew more frantic with every passing second. They weren't cheering anymore. They weren't booing either. They were witnessing something else entirely. Jackson's mind raced, spinning faster than his body. He kept asking himself the same question with every missed strike. Why isn't anything working? His bravado, once thick and impenetrable, began to slip away in layers. Each miss peeled it back, revealing the crack that had always been there, but were easy to hide behind confidence and speed. He felt them widening now, exposed under the weight of Chuck's unwavering stillness. Chuck hadn't spoken a word the entire fight. He didn't need to. His calm presence was enough to push Jaxon deeper into his own doubts. Jackson's breathing became uneven, his chest heaving harder as the pressure mounted. His hands trembled slightly, not from exhaustion, but from something worse, fear. He had never been afraid in the ring before. He had always been the aggressor, the one setting the pace, the one in control. Now, every step he took toward Chuck felt heavier, like wading through water with no shore in sight. He circled again, slower this time, unsure whether to press forward or retreat. His instincts screamed to attack, but something deeper told him it wouldn't matter. Chuck stayed right where he was, not chasing, not threatening, just waiting. Veronica's voice drifted through the arena, soft but filled with quiet clarity. This isn't about speed or strength. This is about presence. Jaxon heard the words, though they sounded distant, like echoes from another room. He kept moving, throwing another quick jab, then a feint, then a hook. Nothing landed. Each miss felt sharper than the last, cutting into him from the inside. The crowd watched in stillness, their eyes fixed not on the strikes but on what was unraveling beneath them. Jackson's thoughts spiraled as the fight stretched on. He had spent years building himself into the fighter the world admired. The undefeated star, the viral sensation, the young man who could do no wrong. But here, in this ring, none of it mattered. Chuck had taken everything away without throwing a punch. The realization began to crush him heavier than any physical blow. His feet slowed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of something he didn't yet understand. Chuck didn't press forward. He remained steady, holding the space between them with quiet ease. Jackson's arms lowered slightly, the fight draining from them as fast as it had once filled him. His chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven breaths. Sweat dripped from his brow, but he didn't wipe it away. He couldn't look away from Chuck now. Not because of fear, but because somewhere deep inside he saw something in Chuck's eyes that shook him to his core. Calm. Complete, unshakable calm. Jackson's heart pounded louder than the noise of the crowd, louder than the commentary, louder than anything. He had spent his whole career chasing attention, chasing the next big moment, the next knockout, the next headline. But Chuck wasn't chasing anything, and somehow that was what terrified him most. He stood there motionless, watching, as Jaxon slowly began to fall apart from within. Veronica's voice returned quiet and somber. Sometimes the hardest opponent to face is yourself. The words echoed through the quiet arena, landing heavily in the air. Jackson's hands dropped further. His shoulders slumped. His pride slipping from his body like sand through an open hand. He wasn't fighting Chuck anymore. He was fighting the reflection of everything he feared, and for the first time he wasn't sure he would win. Jaxon stood in the center of the ring, his chest still heaving, his body drained, but his mind suddenly clear. The weight of pride had started to slip from his shoulders, replaced by something quieter, something unfamiliar. He no longer looked at Chuck with defiance, but with a hesitant, searching gaze. Chuck remained steady and calm as ever, offering no words, but everything in his stance said patience. He didn't push forward. He didn't pressure. He simply waited, leaving space for Jaxon to choose his next step. For the first time, Jaxon didn't rush to fill that space with another reckless attack. He breathed deeply, grounding himself, letting the moment settle before making his next move. Slowly, he lifted his hands again, but this time there was no bravado in the gesture. Gone were the dramatic flourishes and exaggerated posturing. His hands rose with purpose, quiet and respectful, focused more on balance than performance. His feet, adjusted too lighter now, grounded in technique instead of showmanship. Chuck's eyes softened almost imperceptibly, a quiet signal of approval. He shifted just slightly enough to show he recognized the change, yet still offered no aggression in return. He was guiding, not testing. Jaxon moved forward cautiously, every step measured, every breath deliberate. He no longer chased the knockout or the spotlight. He was chasing something else entirely now. He extended a simple jab, slow and thoughtful, testing the waters without the rush of pride behind it. Chuck accepted the motion with calm grace, slipping just enough to show him the space between them. No counter, no punishment. It was an invitation, not a rejection. Jaxon reset, and the lesson is beginning to take root. His next movement was sharper, but still controlled a clean combination, aimed not to overwhelm but to find rhythm and clarity. Chuck moved alongside him, stepping through the pattern like a quiet partner in a dance. The shift in the arena was subtle at first. The younger crowd, once eager for knockouts and taunts, grew quiet as they watched the unexpected change unfold. The older fans began to lean forward, their faces softening with quiet recognition. Veronica's voice floated through the speakers, warm and reverent. This is no longer a fight. This is something else. This is learning. Jaxon began to see it too. His strikes grew smoother, stripped of ego, built from patience and attention. He watched Chuck's subtle movements following without fear, learning through quiet imitation. Chuck continued to guide him, never overpowering, never rushing. Each step was gentle, and every redirection was respectful. He moved like a river flowing around a rock, showing Jaxon how to let go of force and embrace control. The more Jaxon followed, the lighter his body felt. The tension in his shoulders eased, and the frantic pulse of his heart slowed to something steady and strong. The crowd could feel it too. They no longer sat on edge waiting for a brutal ending. They sat in peaceful awe, witnessing something far rarer. Jaxon's breathing grew calm as he settled into the rhythm. His strikes were no longer desperate or wild. They were precise, thoughtful, and connected to something deeper than winning. Chuck mirrored him just enough to keep the flow alive, slipping in and out of range with ease, offering quiet corrections through his movement. No words were exchanged, yet entire lessons passed between them with every step. Jaxon's eyes began to clear. He started seeing the ring not as a place for dominance, but as a space for discipline, respect, and personal truth. The crowd leaned into the moment, drawn by its quiet beauty. Phones were lowered. No one wanted to watch this through a screen. They wanted to feel it. Victor Grayson sat in stunned silence, unable to process how the spectacle had become something so gentle, so powerful. He had wanted a viral fight, but what he was witnessing felt far bigger than that. Veronica's voice returned soft and full of quiet wonder. This is what happens when the noise fades. This is what remains when the ego falls away. Jaxon stepped forward again, but this time with grace. He didn't fight against Chuck anymore. He moved with him, learning, growing, and getting along. Chuck's every gesture was a silent reassurance, a nod of quiet encouragement that kept the flow alive. There was no need for words between them. The understanding was shared in the way they moved together. The longer they danced through the ring, the more Jaxon's expression shifted. The weight he had carried for so long seemed to fall away with every exchange step. He was no longer performing. He was present. Chuck finally stepped back, offering a pause, allowing Jaxon to stand still for a moment in the quiet they had created. Jaxon lowered his hands slowly, not in surrender, but in calm acceptance. The crowd remained hushed, their faces softened by what they had witnessed. They had come seeking a fight, but had been given something far more meaningful. Jaxon looked across the ring, his chest steady, his breath even. His eyes met Chuck's with something that hadn't been there before. Respect. Pure, honest respect. Chuck offered the faintest of nods, a small gesture that carried the weight of everything they had shared in those silent exchanges. Jaxon nodded back, no longer the brash fighter who had entered the ring. He stood there now, as a student, humbled and grateful. The arena seemed to exhale as one, the energy softened, but richer somehow. Veronica's voice lingered one last time, quiet and filled with hope. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't in defeating another. It's in mastering yourself. At that moment, everyone knew the truth. Jaxon had entered the ring to fight a legend, but he was leaving it with something far greater. He had discovered the beginning of wisdom. And it had all started with letting go. Jaxon stood in the center of the ring. Something in him had completely changed. The weight of pride that once clung to every movement had vanished. In its place was quiet, focused, steady, and open. He no longer looked at Chuck as an opponent. He saw him as something far more meaningful, a teacher. Chuck's expression remained calm, but there was a subtle warmth in his eyes, a quiet approval that needed no words. He shifted slightly, guiding Jaxon forward with the smallest motion of his hand. There was no pressure, no force, just a gentle invitation to continue. Jaxon stepped in, but this time there was no hesitation or fear. He moved with patience, letting instinct guide him instead of ego. His body listened now not just to itself, but to Chuck's presence. Chuck moved with him, slow and smooth, showing openings with deliberate care. He gave Jaxon space to explore, to learn, never rushing, never overwhelming. It was a rhythm built on respect. Jaxon adjusted, testing new angles, keeping his strikes sharp but controlled. He wasn't fighting for dominance anymore. He was discovering something new at every step. The crowd watched, mesmerized by the quiet dance unfolding before them. What had begun as a spectacle had turned into something far more intimate. It was no longer about entertainment. It was about transformation. Veronica's voice carried through the air, soft and filled with awe. He's not just learning to fight, he's learning to listen. Jaxon's movements grew more refined with each exchange. He followed Chuck's subtle cues, shifting his feet, adjusting his guard, and letting his body absorb lessons that couldn't be taught with words. There was a calmness in him now, a quiet joy that came from feeling himself grow in real time. He wasn't seeking to impress anyone in the crowd. He was simply present, fully absorbed in the process. Chuck's guidance remained patient, steady as a tide. He showed slight shifts in weight and tiny changes in balance, letting Jaxon see how small adjustments could open new paths. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't dramatic. It was beautiful in its simplicity. Jaxon began to smile, not with arrogance, but with quiet wonder. He felt something click inside, something that had eluded him for years. The ring, once a stage for his ego, had become a classroom. Chuck didn't speak, but his every move was a quiet affirmation. He was teaching through action, and Jaxon was listening with every fiber of his being. The crowd had fallen completely silent, caught in the gentle spell unfolding before them. No one shouted. No one cheered. They simply watched, their faces soft with understanding. Veronica's voice grew tender, her words carrying deep emotion. "We are witnessing something rare tonight. Not a fight, but a young man finding his way back to himself." Jaxon kept moving now, fully in sync with the rhythm Chuck had set. He no longer forced anything. He flowed with it, allowing the dance to guide him. His breathing was steady, his body light and responsive. He felt a quiet strength, one that didn't need to shout or show off. It was enough just to feel it. Chuck continued to offer him openings, letting him practice, letting him learn through touch and movement. He corrected mistakes, not with force, but with gentle pressure sandlight redirections that guided Jaxon back on course. Jaxon absorbed every moment, his mind clear, his heart open. He had never felt this before. Not in all his victories, not in all his fame. This was something deeper. Satisfaction from simply improving. Veronica's voice wavered slightly, her heart full as she spoke. This is what every fighter hopes for. Not the trophies, not the titles. But this is a moment of real growth. Jaxon's face softened, as he moved his earlier intensity replaced by calm joy. He didn't even glance at the crowd anymore. His focus stayed on Chuck, on the quiet conversation they shared through motion. Chuck's patience never wavered. He led Jaxon through more refined sequences now, showing him how to move with both grace and power. Every exchange became a lesson in balance, timing, and respect. Jaxon responded beautifully, no longer chasing the outcome, but appreciating every step of the process. He had become a student again, and in that, he had found peace. The arena watched as the two men continued their quiet exchange, the atmosphere warm and full of unspoken connection. What had begun as a contest had become a bridge between generations, a passing of wisdom from teacher to student. Veronica's voice grew soft, nearly a whisper. Some lessons aren't about victory. They are about remembering what truly matters. Jaxon's face lit with quiet gratitude as he moved through another sequence, guided by Chuck's steady hand. He could feel the change in himself, not just as a fighter, but as a person. Chuck gave one final gentle nod, signaling the end of their shared practice. He stepped back, letting Jaxon stand in the center of the ring alone, his chest rising slowly and steadily, his expression full of quiet pride. The crowd rose to their feet, but it wasn't a roar. It was soft applause, full of warmth, full of respect. They weren't applauding a victor. They were honoring a student who had found his humility. Jaxon bowed his head slightly, his eyes glistening with something far more powerful than pride. Gratitude. He turned to face Chuck once more, offering a respectful nod that said everything his words couldn't. "Thank you." Chuck returned the gesture. His face calm, his presence steady. No words were needed. The lesson had been learned. And a new student had emerged. Jaxon stood alone in the ring, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The noise of the world outside seemed far away. In this space, there was only the quiet weight of what had just unfolded. He turned slowly, his gaze searching through the crowd until it landed on Samuel Cole. The old champion sat still in his seat, his face calm but alert, watching with the same quiet dignity he had carried through the entire night. Jaxon's feet carried him toward the ropes, his steps steady but without urgency. He didn't rush. He didn't play to the cameras. He moved with purpose, driven by something deeper than performance. The crowd watched in complete silence, their attention drawn not by spectacle, but by something more profound taking shape before them. Jaxon reached the edge of the ring and looked down at Samuel, holding his gaze. Without hesitation, Jaxon stepped down from the ring and walked toward the older man. The arena seemed to hold its breath each moment, stretching longer as he approached. He stopped in front of Samuel, his face clear of arrogance or shame. For a brief second, they simply looked at each other. No words passed between them, but everything that needed to be said was already there, resting in the air between them. Jaxon took a deep breath, then lowered himself into a full bow. He didn't just nod. He bent low, folding himself with deliberate care, offering the deepest gesture of respect he had ever made in his life. The room erupted into quiet applause, not loud and wild, but steady and heartfelt. It was the kind of applause that carried reverence, the kind that acknowledged not victory, but growth. Samuel remained still for a moment, watching the young fighter's head lowered before him. Then, with the grace of a man who had seen many lifetimes of fights and forgiveness, he rose slowly to his feet. He placed a weathered hand gently on Jaxon's shoulder, accepting the gesture with calm strength. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The crowd rose to their feet in unison, a standing ovation spreading from the front rows to the farthest corners of the arena. It wasn't about who had won or lost. It was about what had been restored. Veronica's voice came through softly, full of warmth and emotion. Tonight wasn't about fighting. It was about respect, about finding the courage to bow. Jaxon stood slowly, lifting his head to meet Samuel's eyes. In those eyes, he saw no judgment, no resentment, only quiet pride and acceptance. They shared a small nod, simple but filled with meaning, the kind of nod that bridges generations, that closes old wounds without a word. The arena stayed on its feet the moment stretching as people absorbed the weight of what they had witnessed. For the first time that night, the space felt united. No younger or older, no sides, just shared reverence. Jaxon turned back toward the ring, his steps lighter now, his posture no longer burdened by anything false. He had come into the night as a fighter seeking fame. He was leaving it as something entirely different. He paused at the ropes, glancing once more at Chuck, who watched from his quiet corner with the same steady calm. There was no need for another exchange. The lesson had been learned. The respect had been earned. As Jaxon left the ring for the final time, the applause softened into something almost like a blessing. It wasn't about his record or his image anymore. It was about the humility he had shown and the dignity he had found. The arena slowly returned to stillness, but the feeling lingered. A shared peace, the kind that stays long after the lights fade and the crowds go home. In that space, surrounded by the echoes of the past and the quiet hope of the future, one thing was clear. Respect endures. And sometimes the most powerful victory is knowing when to bow. The arena had emptied, but the air still held the weight of everything that had happened. In a quiet corner, away from the lingering staff and scattered equipment, Jaxon sat across from Samuel Cole. There were no cameras here, no microphones. Just two men generations apart sharing the same quiet space. Jaxon kept his head lowered at first, staring at the floor, his hands clasped together tightly. He had faced countless fighters, but this felt harder than any round he had ever fought. His voice came low, steady, but uncertain. "I owe you more than an apology." He paused, taking a deep breath, the words catching in his throat before they could rise. "I didn't just disrespect you tonight. I disrespected everything this sport is supposed to stand for." Samuel's face remained calm, his hands resting loosely on his lap. He had no need to fill the space with noise. He let Jaxon speak, waiting patiently, giving him room to release the words that had been weighing him down. Jaxon looked up, his eyes filled with something raw, something far from pride. "I thought fighting was about proving you're better, about proving you're the strongest or the fastest. But out there, I realized I didn't even know what it really meant." Samuel's gaze softened the deep lines of his face, catching the light in quiet shadows. He nodded slowly, his voice steady but warm. "Most young fighters start that way. They think it's about dominance, about leaving a mark others can't ignore." Jaxon sat up straighter, his eyes locked on Samuel's, eager for answers. "But you didn't seem angry tonight. You didn't even look surprised when I lost control. How can you carry that kind of patience?" Samuel's smile was faint, more a reflection of memory than amusement. "You learn patience the hard way," he said gently. "Through losses, through mistakes, through the nights when no one's watching and all you have left are your regrets." Jackson's chest tightened at those words, hearing them settle into places he hadn't known were empty. He listened closely, letting every word sink in heavier, with meaning than anything he'd heard before. Samuel leaned forward slightly, his eyes kind but unwavering. "Legacy isn't something you can chase. It's not built on victories or headlines. It's built on how you carry yourself, even when no one else is watching." Jackson's throat tightened. He blinked hard, feeling the truth settle in ways he couldn't push away. "I've spent my whole life chasing the wrong things," he admitted, his voice breaking softly around the edges. Samuel's reply came with no judgment, only quiet understanding. "Most of us do at first. The world pushes us toward fame, toward noise, but real strength, it comes when you're willing to stand still to face yourself without hiding behind the fight." Jaxon let those words linger in the space between them, breathing them in as though they were more essential than air. He could feel something shifting inside, something beginning to settle. In the corner of the room, Chuck sat quietly watching with soft eyes. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. This wasn't his moment to lead. It was Samuel's voice that needed to carry through now. Jackson's voice lowered almost a whisper. "How do you live with it, knowing you gave everything but still faded from the spotlight? How do you keep walking without resentment?" Samuel's gaze held steady, the weight of years reflected in his calm stare. "You stop chasing the light," he said simply. "You start finding it inside, in the respect you show others, in the lessons you leave behind." Jaxon sat back slowly, the truth of those words leaving him quiet and still. He had spent years running toward a finish line he now realized didn't exist. Samuel's face softened again, a small smile touching his lips. "You showed more strength tonight in bowing than you ever did in throwing punches." Jackson's eyes welled with something deeper than regret. It was gratitude, humble, quiet gratitude. Samuel reached out, resting his hand gently on Jackson's shoulder, steady and reassuring. "You've still got time to build something that lasts," he said, his voice carrying both warmth and certainty. "But it starts by fighting for the right reasons." Jaxon nodded, his head lowered again, but this time in respect, not shame. The room stayed quiet for a long moment, filled only by the soft hum of lights and the shared stillness of men who understood one another. Chuck remained seated, a faint smile playing on his face as he watched the moment settle. He knew this was exactly where the night was meant to lead. Jaxon finally looked back up at Samuel, his voice steady but soft. "Thank you. Not just for tonight, but for everything I didn't know I needed to learn." Samuel's eyes twinkled with quiet pride, his voice calm and sure. "Then carry it forward. That's how legacies grow." Jaxon nodded again, his heart lighter, his path clearer than it had ever been. The conversation drew to a close, but the bond that had formed would linger far beyond this night. As Jaxon stood to leave, he glanced once more at Chuck, offering him a quiet nod of gratitude too. Chuck simply smiled, offering no words, only a nod in return. Some lessons didn't need to be spoken aloud. They were meant to be carried forward quietly with honor. Samuel sat quietly for a moment after their conversation, his fingers tracing the edge of his jacket pocket with slow, deliberate care. His gaze softened as he reached inside, pulling out something small that glinted faintly under the soft lights. The object rested in his palm, worn but still gleaming, its ribbon faded but intact. Jaxon watched with quiet curiosity, sensing the weight of the moment before a word was spoken. He could see there was something more in Samuel's expression, something deep, wrapped in both pride and reflection. Samuel's voice came low-steady as he held the medal out toward Jaxon. "This is from a time before most folks in this arena could even name the champions from my day." He paused, his fingers tightening briefly around the medal. "But it's not worth much to anyone but me." Jaxon sat forward, his eyes drawn to the small piece of history resting between them. He didn't move to take it. He simply listened, feeling the gravity settle around them like a quiet storm. Samuel's gaze didn't waver as he continued. "I earned this in a match that no one remembers anymore. A fight where I lost, but where I learned what mattered most. Humility, resilience, integrity." Jackson's throat tightened as those words reached him. He could hear the weight in Samuel's voice, a weight that came from years of carrying lessons too heavy to explain with words alone. Samuel slowly extended the medal toward Jaxon again, his hands steady but gentle. "I carried this not because I won, but because it reminded me of the man I became after that loss. And tonight I believe it belongs to you." Jackson's hands trembled slightly as he reached out, his fingers brushing against the cool metal. He accepted it with the utmost care, as though it were made of something more fragile than gold. He stared down at it, his breath catching in his chest. The medal wasn't just old. It was alive with stories, every scratch and worn edge holding a memory. Jaxon felt it immediately, the weight of something far greater than a trophy. He looked up, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say. I don't think I deserve this." Samuel's smile came softly, full of understanding. "You don't have to deserve it. You just have to carry it forward. That's how it works. One generation to the next." Jaxon nodded slowly, cradling the medal in his palms as though it held every lesson he had ever needed to hear. He could feel the shift inside him. Something settling in a place that had been missing for years. Chuck remained seated in the background, his expression warm and steady as he watched. He offered no words, only a quiet nod of approval, his eyes holding the same calm certainty they had all night. Jaxon turned the medal over gently in his hand, studying the faded letters etched along the back. It wasn't the prize itself that moved him. It was the reminder that some victories aren't meant to be displayed on walls or posted online. Some victories are carried quietly, tucked away, and passed down. He looked up again, meeting Samuel's gaze with something new in his eyes. Gratitude. Not the shallow kind, offered out of politeness, but the kind that grows from knowing you've been trusted with something sacred. Jackson's voice came softly, barely above a whisper. "I'll honor this. I'll remember everything it stands for." Samuel's nod was slow, full of pride and peace. "That's all I ask. Keep it close, not just in your hands, but in how you walk through this world." The room remained still, wrapped in the quiet beauty of the moment. Jaxon held the medal close to his chest, his heart steady, his breath deep and sure. He knew now this night hadn't been about fighting at all. It had been about receiving something that couldn't be bought or won. It had been about learning to accept a piece of legacy with humility and care. Chuck's presence remained steady, a silent reminder that some lessons don't need to be explained. They are simply felt and carried forward in actions. Jaxon stood slowly, the medal still resting in his hand, his posture different now, lighter but grounded. He didn't speak again. He knew nothing more needed to be said. As he turned to leave, the medal remained close to his heart, its quiet weight reminding him of everything that mattered. Samuel watched him go, his face calm and full of quiet satisfaction. Chuck's eyes followed a faint smile tracing his lips as he sat in the quiet. The moment had passed from one hand to another, and the story would now continue, carried by a heart finally ready to understand it. The room had settled into a soft hush after Jackson's departure. The air was thick with the quiet weight of everything that had passed. Samuel sat back in his chair, his body still, his expression calm and thoughtful. Chuck remained nearby, seated across from him. His posture relaxed but alert. He hadn't spoken much all night, but his presence had been steady, like a mountain watching over everything. They both understood that some conversations only happen after the noise fades. Samuel's voice broke the silence, low and steady, carrying the ease of old friendship. Funny how we spend most of our lives chasing the next fight only to realize the real work starts after we stop swinging. He let the words drift his gaze, softening with quiet reflection. Chuck smiled faintly, his voice quiet and sure. The fights are just chapters. The real story is what happens in between. He leaned back slightly, his hands resting calmly in his lap, as though the night had offered no surprises at all. They shared a look, the kind that only comes from years of shared ground. No need for an explanation. No need to fill the space with words that weren't necessary. They had both walked long roads to get here. Samuel chuckled softly, his breath steady, his tone light but tinged with memory. Have you ever thought we'd end up here, not in the ring, not in the spotlight, but sitting in the shadows watching someone else begin their story? Chuck's eyes glimmered with quiet amusement. I always figured this was the goal. He paused for a breath, letting the moment stretch. The spotlight burns too hot to stay under it forever. Samuel nodded slowly, his face thoughtful, the lines along his cheeks deepening as he smiled. It does. And yet, folks think the light is where the power lives. They don't see how the quiet moments really shape everything. Chuck's reply came with calm certainty. The loudest lessons don't need an audience. His voice carried a weight that came from years of living those words, not just speaking them. Samuel leaned back, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the room. I've come to believe that legacy is less about what people remember us for, and more about what they carry forward without even knowing it came from us. He let the words settle, his breath slow and full of peace. Chuck nodded, once his agreement quiet but solid. Planting seeds, that's all it ever was. We plant them, not knowing if we'll ever see them grow. Their conversation drifted easily, each word soaked in patience, their voices soft but steady in the quiet room. They had both spent decades being asked about victories, about fights, about records. But this was different. This was about what lasted beyond it all. Samuel's smile grew touched by something softer now, something close to gratitude. Watching that kid tonight, I saw myself in him. Young. Lost. Chasing something I couldn't name back then. Chuck's gaze stayed gentle, his words spoken like a quiet breeze. We all had that moment. The only difference is whether we're lucky enough to have someone help us through it. They both fell silent again, letting those words sit between them. There was no rush here, no need to force the pace. Some things are meant to be felt in their own time. Samuel's voice returned even softer now. I think what struck me most tonight wasn't his change. It was how the crowd changed with him, how they sat there not looking for blood but leaning in to watch a young man grow up. Chuck's face held a faint, approving smile. People recognize the truth when they see it. No matter how loud the world gets, there's something about quiet growth that cuts through everything else. Samuel exhaled slowly, his hands resting easily on his knees. Do you think he'll carry it? Think he'll hold on to what he found tonight? Chuck's eyes stayed thoughtful, his voice warm and steady. He will. You can see it in his eyes. He's not chasing the same things anymore. The room grew quieter, filled with a calm that only comes from shared understanding. They both knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy for Jaxon, but they also knew he had taken the first step, and that mattered more than anything. Samuel's voice grew softer still, almost like a sigh. Feels good, doesn't it? Knowing we didn't have to throw a punch to change something tonight. Chuck's smile deepened, a quiet glimmer of pride in his eyes. That's the best kind of fight, the ones you win by standing still. They both laughed softly, the sound easy and light. like old friends sharing a memory, only they understood. Their laughter faded into a comfortable silence, but neither of them moved to leave. They stayed seated, two men shaped by decades of battles, content to let the night linger. Samuel's gaze drifted toward the empty space where Jaxon had been. Have you ever wondered how many more we'll get to guide before our time's up? Chuck's voice was calm and peaceful as he answered. It doesn't matter how many. It just matters that we keep planting. Samuel smiled, his face full of quiet contentment. That's enough, isn't it? Chuck nodded once, firm and sure. It's more than enough. They sat there together, two legends wrapped in the stillness of the moment, their hearts light, their spirits full. They knew their names might fade someday. Their records would be forgotten, and their fights would be replaced by those of others. But what mattered most had already been done. The seeds were planted, and somewhere out there they were already beginning to grow. In the quiet hours after the arena had gone dark, Jaxon sat alone with his phone in his hands. He didn't scroll through the usual streams of reactions or clips from the night. He wasn't looking for highlights or headlines. He simply opened a blank post, his heart steady and his mind clear. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, then began to type slowly with purpose. The words came easily, not crafted for effect, but spoken from somewhere deeper. Legacy isn't about the noise you make. It's about the respect you carry and the lessons you leave behind. He didn't add a photo or a flashy video. No hashtags, no filters, just those words left to stand on their own. Within minutes, the post began to spread across the internet, drawing attention from every corner. Some people were surprised by his quiet tone, while others felt the weight of the message immediately. Comments poured in full of curiosity, support, and reflection. Many wrote about the unexpected grace of his transformation. Others shared how the simple post had struck something personal in them, a reminder that real strength often looks nothing like what the world expects. His words moved across timelines like ripples, small but steady. But far from the screens in a quiet corner of the city, Jaxon wasn't watching any of it. The gym was old, its walls worn, and its equipment simple, but it felt right. The mirrors were scratched and faded. The floors creaked under steady footsteps. It wasn't a place built for show. Jaxon moved through his drills alone, his breath calm, his strikes clean and deliberate. There were no cameras here. No one stood by to capture his effort or track his progress. It was just him, his body, and the sound of gloves meeting the heavy bag. His pace was steady, not rushed or frantic. Every movement came from a place of focus, stripped of showmanship and ego. He worked in silence, sweat building slowly as he returned to the fundamentals. There was peace in its simplicity, a sense of satisfaction that came not from the applause of others, but from knowing he was growing at his own pace in his own time. The medal Samuel had given him rested nearby on the bench, its ribbon folded carefully, its surface catching the dim light. He glanced at it every so often, not for motivation, but as a quiet reminder of everything he now carried within him. The hours passed unnoticed as he continued his training, lost in the rhythm of discipline and patience. The world outside might have been buzzing with his name, but inside these walls there was only the work. Far from the gym, Veronica's voice came through softly, her words woven into a reflective broadcast, meant not for headlines, but for hearts ready to listen. Sometimes the loudest stories don't happen in front of a crowd. They unfold quietly in places where no one is watching, where change takes root slow and steady beneath the surface. Her voice carried a warmth full of understanding and quiet hope. People often look for grand endings. They wait for big moments to tie everything together, but real change isn't loud. It doesn't ask for attention. It moves like water, carving new paths over time. As Jaxon moved through another round of shadowboxing, His face remained calm, his focus unwavering. He wasn't chasing the next big fight. He wasn't thinking about his image or his past mistakes. He was simply present, fully committed to the moment, to the process of becoming something better. Veronica's words continued, her voice soft but sure. Legacy isn't built in the spotlight. It grows in quiet corners. In the early mornings. In empty gyms. In the places where you choose to show up for yourself, even when no one else is there to see it. Jaxon finished his training for the night. His breath steady, his body tired but content. He sat down on the bench, his hands resting on his knees, the weight of the medal beside him, a steady reminder of everything he had learned. He didn't need to post about this moment. He didn't need to capture it or share it. He simply sat in the stillness, feeling the calm settle around him, knowing this was where the real work happened. Veronica's final words drifted through, leaving a lasting echo. Some stories don't end with a roar. They end with quiet steps taken in the right direction, and those steps create ripples that last far longer than any applause. Jaxon stood slipping the medal into his bag with care. Then, without fanfare, he turned off the lights, locked the door, and walked back into the night. He didn't need the world to watch. He had already started becoming the man he was meant to be.